Thanks, everybody. My name is Boris Wertz. I'm the founding partner of Version 1 Ventures. Version 1 is a $20 million seed and Series A fund. We invest in 3 verticals: commerce, software as a service, and marketplaces platforms. Some of our more notable investments include Indiegogo, Flurry, Edmodo, and here in Seattle, Julep. Really excited to talk about how to build a really large business, and actually how to build a $100 million business. And I really think there's only 2 ways to do that. And before I say that, I have to get the clicker, because otherwise, sorry, we can't move the slides. So why a $100 million business? And why the number 100 million? And really comes down to the question if you're VC fundable or not. Let me put it that way. You can build a great business without taking ever VC money. You can bootstrap it. You can take angel money. But VCs have a certain math to make their fund. And the panel just before this one talked about a little bit the VC math. So let's assume a $20 million fund, seed fund like Version 1 Ventures. If we want to be top of our class of VC funds, we have to return 3 to 4x the capital we raise from our investors. So that means $60 to $80 million. If you then also assume that at exit we probably own about 5% of the company, of the portfolio companies, we need to be part of exits of about $1.6 billion on 20 to 25 investments. That really shows that you have to go for large outcomes and you have to go for really large businesses. So that's why VCs kind of think about investing in large outcomes and choosing that arbitrary number of $100 million. So how to build a really large business? In the end, it really comes down to a very basic formula. It really comes down to your potential of earning revenues from customers, and then on the other way, how much you pay to acquire these customers. So LTV, lifetime value, over customer acquisition costs. And at scale, ideally, you want to be 4 or 5 times lifetime value to customer acquisition cost. So when you have that basic formula in mind, there's really 2 ways to do that. Either you have a business that has a really high lifetime value, and you can use that lifetime value to acquire customers at scale, or you find a way to acquire tens of millions, perhaps even hundreds of millions of customers for free through virality and word of mouth, and then you don't have to worry so much about the monetization level because you have these large amounts of customers on your platform. So let's talk a little bit about the different models. So the first one is high lifetime value per user, and you usually find that in transactional businesses, software as a service or e-commerce businesses. So let's take an example of a software as a service business. Let's assume it sells business management software to a vertical in the SMB market. So probably they're going to have an average revenue per user of about $70 per month. They probably also have a churn rate of about 2%, meaning 2% of the customers churn out every month, and they can keep the average customer for about 50 months. So that means you get to a lifetime value of $3,500. That's really what you have, you can play with, right, to acquire customers. And there's different acquisition channels that you can use. Everything from the really cheap free ones like word of mouth and SEO to the much more expensive ones that involve outreach through an outbound sales force or going to trade shows. Keeping in mind how much you can spend from your lifetime value and keeping in mind an ideal ratio of LTV to customer acquisition cost of 4 or 5 to 1, you might be able to use only a few or all of these acquisition channels. So for example, in this case of a software as a service company selling to SMBs, the outbound sales probably is $1,000, $1,500 per acquired customer, so you already lose a lot of flexibility on such high acquisition cost. As a next step, you certainly think about how can I increase the lifetime value of that business. And there's really two ways. You can either increase the ARPU, and two of the most successful strategies are either upselling, so selling customers premium features that pay more, or over time, as you build trust, as you build a brand, you can move into enterprise accounts, larger accounts. You might start with the kind of SMBs of 5 to 10 employees, and over time you might move into franchises that have perhaps 100 employees or 200 employees, and you increase the ARPU. Secondly, you can decrease churn and hopefully get to a churn rate that is close to 1% per month. Things to do here is usually increase the utility of your product, so move it from a nice-to-have to a must-have product. Or secondly, think about better ways to onboard the customer and get them really hooked on the product, so everything that has to do with customer success. So let's talk about the second model. Second model is all about virality, word of mouth, and really you find that in social networks and in platforms, usually businesses that are financed by advertising sales. Let's look at Facebook. Facebook only monetizes with $6 a year per user. It's a really low monetization compared to what we discussed before in the SaaS business. But at the same time, they were able to get over 1 billion monthly active users, mostly for free. And they really scaled to a $6 billion business a year. So tons and tons of users that they have that they're monetizing at a very low rate. So other examples would be Instagram or Snapchat or YouTube, you name it. But in the end, these businesses all scale through two ways. They have a really high viral effect in the beginning. So word of mouth as I'm sharing the product and the service with my friends. So you see that a lot in communication products or social games. And ideally, then they have also network effects. So meaning that each additional user provides additional value to the network, and you create really important lock-in effects. You see that in marketplaces like Craigslist, crowdfunding platforms like Indiegogo, or again on Twitter. So it usually starts with virality, and then hopefully you can create a network effect over time. The challenge is really that a lot of startups are stuck in the middle. They neither have one or the other model. So think about these three examples. The first one is news curation. So if a company offers a personalized news curation service that delivers me on a daily basis the best news stories I should follow, this is a great service for me as a customer. Unfortunately, it won't really create a lot of virality because this is very personal for me, it's super valuable to me, but I'm not going to forward it to my friends because they might have completely different interests or taste. So you have low virality, and it's going to be really hard to acquire customers for free. At the same time, it's also really hard to monetize. It's probably an advertising business, and you need to have some scale to really get there. Or think about a low utility SaaS product. Often I see that in marketing tools for SMBs. On the one hand side, because it's a low utility, it's more a nice to have product, I can probably only charge a very low ARPU. So let's assume $30. At the same time, usually in these products, you see quite a bit of churn. So 7 to 8% a month as people churn out, don't get hooked on the product, realize they don't really need it after a few months, and don't want to pay for it. So suddenly you end up with a really low lifetime value of about $400. And if you go back to the different sales acquisition, marketing acquisition channels we discussed before, from word of mouth to outbound, you also know that probably 2/3 of those acquisition channels you can't even use anymore to scale that business because you only can work with a lifetime value of $400. And most of these acquisition channels are much more expensive than that. Or last example out of the e-commerce area, think about a retailer that only sells one product, women boots, for example. Usually you have a very low purchase frequency, and therefore really low LTV. On the acquisition side, you compete against multi-product retailers like Amazon that can amortize the acquisition cost through multiple purchases, through multiple categories, etc. So it's really tough to scale a business when you have a low LTV, but at the same time, you compete with people on the acquisition front that have multi-products, much higher purchase frequency, etc. So if there's 3 takeaways you should think about from this talk are those. The first one is, think about how big your opportunity is that you're working on. And if you feel confident that it's a really large opportunity, you should go for VC funding. But as I said before, I think you can build great companies without ever raising VC money. VCs just have a certain math in place for their fund that makes them look at and invest in really large opportunities. The second one is, conceptually, there's really only 2 models to really get to a large company. Either you have a high lifetime value per customer, and you can use that high lifetime value to acquire customers at scale, or you have a really high viral coefficient and potentially even network effects that lets you amass tens and hundreds of millions of people for free, and then monetization level becomes secondary. But I think a more general takeaway from this whole thing is, you really need to think about distribution for your startup from the beginning on. In a world where we have more and more startups that are competing to kind of get the attention of customers, of investors, distribution is really key. And when I think about one of the most common mistakes I see in startups is they haven't really thought about their distribution strategy. They think about building a great product and they will come, and that usually doesn't work. So think about distribution first. It starts with a great product, but distribution is such a key element of startup success that you need to think about it from the beginning on. Thanks very much. We'll open it up for questions on the topic, and please feel free to ask questions now. I think we have a mic in the room. John had a mic. If not, I'm going to repeat the questions. What's that? Thanks.
So you mentioned lifetime value, cost of customer acquisition, and churn and retention being really, really critical for SaaS businesses. How do you think about those weird, so we have this weird model where we're sort of like one, sort of like the other, in the middle, stuck in the middle, as you said. We have a very low cost of customer acquisition, like $90 approximately all in for marketing, and then a lifetime value that's in the $900, $1,000 range, but a high churn, like more like the 6-7% than the 2%, 1%. How do you think about trying to work on that?
I think so I think 2 things that I would really think about in that respect. The first one is, usually as you scale a company, customer acquisition costs go up over time. So if you pay $90 right now, if you really want to build a large company, probably that's going to be rather closer to $200-300 over time as you get into less and less efficient marketing channels, right? So right now your ratio of $900 to 90 might be great, but it's certainly going to deteriorate over time. I think my general belief is, if you're having a churn rate of 7 to 8%, that means you churn out your whole user base every year. You need to think about...
Wait, so sorry, not to jump in, but what actually happens is you just have high churn. Usually, you just have high churn in the first few months, and then you keep, some contingent, right? Yeah. So like...
Then you're probably acquiring the wrong customers, right? So right, I would go back and think about my customer acquisition strategy, because it looks like there's a certain segment of the customers that stay with you, but at the same time you bring in tons of people on the top end that will never really stay with you. So I've seen that many times, and often it's linked to size of the company you're attracting. There's a lot of people that want to try it out, they don't have the internal resources, they sign up, after 3 months they realize, hey, I didn't really use that tool a single time,
Totally.
and then they churn out. And usually what a good strategy for that is raise your minimum price. You're going to lose all these people up front, you're going to have a much healthier business, and you're really going to focus your acquisition and onboarding and customer service activities on the people that are really going to stick around.
That's an interesting idea. Thank you.
All right, so if anybody else has questions for Boris, we've got Mike over here on this side, and just raise your hand and we can jump on out. We're trying to leave a little bit of time for questions with each of the speakers this afternoon. And Boris, I actually have a different question for you. You know, you're from Vancouver, BC. That's where you're based right now. Can you speak to the regionality that you're seeing in terms of the cross-pollination of money and entrepreneurs and talent, sort of in the Cascadia region, the Portland, Seattle, BC area? And whether it's as much as you'd like to see, or whether you'd rather those three areas of the region stayed, you know, a little bit more isolated and unto themselves.
Yeah, I think we've seen an improvement between the Pacific Northwest exchange on both capital and entrepreneurs. At the same time, I think, like, you know, in the end, we're living in an age where there's not a lot of boundaries anymore. Think about, we talk about AngelList, and you can kind of get investors from everywhere around the world. You know, you think about version 1, we actually did 14 investments to date, only 3 in Seattle and Vancouver, 11 outside of that. So 4 in Toronto, 2 in the Valley, 1 in New York, 1 in Montreal, 1 in LA. So we're really trying to find the best entrepreneurs, the best opportunities, you know, in the verticals, in the areas we're focusing on. And I think in the same stage, I think entrepreneurs should really look for the best entrepreneurs, the best investors around the world that really understand the model and can be helpful. Now, there's always a local aspect to it, and certainly we would love to have entrepreneurs just around the corner, and entrepreneurs would love investors around the corner. But I think today, I don't think so much in terms of geographies anymore, as in more thesis-driven, business model-driven entrepreneurs and investors that fit or might not fit together.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Boris. Appreciate the time.
Thank you.
Thanks.